What saved a Viking winter? Cunning, calculation, and a few centuries of small experiments in keeping food alive. How did communities built on marginal soil and exposed coasts turn mud, wind, and ice into a reliable store that could outlast months of darkness? If battles were theatre, what passed for victory each spring was quieter? Barrels that had not burst, corn that had not moulded, fish that could be resurrected into a stew. Who designed those cellars, smoke bays, and storehouses? And how did their choices shape voyages, settlements, and the fate of men who crossed oceans? Ask those questions, and you begin to understand that much of what we call Viking power rose from pantries more than from swords. The story unfolds across millennia of local practice and a few decisive innovations in Northern Europe, from roughly the late 1st millennium AD through the Middle Ages. It is a story of sun, salt, peat, and the human willingness to learn from failure. If you like uncovering the quiet technologies of the past, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is while you're watching. Your answer will tell us how far this winter story still reaches. The Viking Age is usually dated from 793 AD, the raid on Lindisfarne, through 1066 AD, the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Those dates frame the most famous outward movements, but food logistics stretch before and after them. In the century before 793, AD northern peoples had already refined seasonal strategies. After 1066 AD, the same techniques continued to underpin daily life. If we accept the Viking Age as a useful frame, then we must also accept that the practical skills that kept people fed were developed over generations. Field management at summer solstice, the construction of stabber, the raised storehouses of the Norwegian farm, the longhouse hearth that doubled as a smokehouse, the seaside drying racks that turned fish into freight. Start in the longhouse, the centre of domestic life across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. Archaeological excavations at places like Borg in Lofoten and at later sites in Iceland and Greenland reveal longhouses that were not mere sleeping quarters. Their plan was a multi-purpose climate system. A central hearth provided heat and a smoke stream. Beneath or adjacent to the highest heat was often a cool, dark pit or subfloor area. Archaeologists call them storage pits, sometimes cellars, where grains, dairy, and certain vegetables were kept. The exact term Zaval sometimes appears in retellings, but the evidence we have is for varied local names and practices. The precise vocabulary differs by region and period. It is, however, widely assumed and supported by excavation that northern houses often incorporated deliberately cooler spaces close to the hearth for preservation. Why place a cellar near the hearth and not at a distance? It is a compromise. Heat from the fire reduced the risk of freezing solid in exposed northern latitudes, while the surrounding earth provided stable coolness, keeping temperatures above freezing and below the conditions that promote bacterial growth. The stable subterranean temperature of the soil between roughly 1 and 6 degrees Celsius produces a better environment than the exposed air that oscillates violently with each storm. This was not mystical knowledge, it came from repeated experience. When a cellar failed, people learned quickly. Above the living space, under the roof, was another deliberate environment, the smoke attic. Many longhouses lacked chimneys in the modern sense. Smoke rose through small vents or simply through a leaky ridge. Instead of banishing smoke, Norse households used it. Meat and fish were hung from rafters, never sealed off, and the continuous thin smoke of peat or wood preserved them. The attic was hot and smoky, an antiseptic, drying atmosphere that discouraged insects and slowed decay by dehydrating tissues and by depositing phenolic compounds that inhibit bacteria. Archaeologically, charred beams, residues of smoked fat, and the location of hooks give consistent evidence for this practice across Norway, Iceland, Shetland, and Orkney. Beyond the longhouse, the stabber stands out. These raised storehouses on posts, stabber in Norwegian, stabber in later usage, are well attested in medieval Scandinavian sources and remain visible in rural Norway today. They solve two specific problems: damp from the ground and pests. By elevating grain and other dry goods 4 or 5 feet above the ground, air circulates under the floor and rodents find access more difficult. Gaps were deliberately left between floorboards. Walls were sometimes slatted to allow dry wind to pass through and prevent fungal growth. Doors were small and low to minimize heat loss and to reduce the temptation to open them. Locks were simple but effective. The presence of locks in the archaeological record and of accounts in sagas and law codes, shows that stored food was valuable enough to protect. All of this architecture was aimed at a single strategic objective: to slow time. In a northern agrarian calendar, the summer burst of production must be stretched across months when fields were under snow and daylight dropped to a few hours. That required choices: what to consume immediately, what to preserve, and what to convert into forms that would survive weeks or years. Grain sits at the centre of the argument, despite cinematic images of Viking feasts built around slabs of meat. Primary calorie intake for most households came from cereals. Barley, Hordeum vulgar, dominates the archaeobotanical record for northern settlements. It tolerates poor soils and a short growing season. Pollen profiles and seed remains at sites in Norway. The Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland show barley cultivation across the settlement periods. Barley was versatile, baked into dense flatbreads and cakes, boiled into porridge, grøt, served day after day, and malted into ale. Rye C400 and 1600 AD presence in eastern Scandinavia, and oats provided regional variation. Rye made darker, longer-lasting bread in the continental zones. Oats served as porridge and as supplementary fodder. The image here matters. Barley was not luxury, it was currency. In the medieval Norse world, grain often stood in legal accounts and fines, appearing in law codes as units of value. Farmers who could fill their storehouses with grain were not only feeding kin, they were building reserves that could be exchanged for ironwork, salt, and imported luxuries. The stabber existed because grain mattered. Its construction is an economic choice made of timber, stone, and labour. Women's labour in turning grain to food must be emphasised. Hand mills, quern stones, sometimes simple saddle querns, feature heavily in domestic assemblages. Turning a quern for hours was normal work. A woman or a team would grind and regrind to produce a rough flour. That flour did not leaven into airy loaves. Bread was flat and dense, sometimes baked on a hot stone or pan. It stored longer than modern bread, but it was heavy and compact. Porridge, grøt, was the daily staple, often cooked in water, occasionally in milk when dairy allowed, and enhanced with whatever flavouring was available: dried berries, a smear of butter, or a spoonful of skyer. Skyer deserves attention. Today known as an Icelandic product, skyer has roots in early medieval dairy processing. It is not identical to modern yogurt. It is closer to a strained cheese, protein-dense, low in fat, and long-lasting when stored cool. In a world where fresh milk sours in a day or two, churning and fermentation become technologies of survival. Skyer was consumed fresh for nourishment. The byproduct whey had uses as a brine, a cooking medium, or even a preservative, because its acidity can slow spoilage. Butter, another caloric concentrate, was produced in surplus in the summer when cows grazed on lush pastures. In regions with access to salt, butter could be salt cured. In places where salt was scarce, people developed other methods, packing butter into waterproof containers and placing them in peat bogs. The anaerobic, cold, and acidic conditions of a peat bog reduce microbial activity. Butter stored this way can survive for years, albeit with a changed flavour. Archaeologists have found medieval contexts where bog-stored fats appear to have been deliberately archived. It is a testimony to the Norse ability to reuse local environments for biochemical preservation. Now to the sea, the dramatic story of stockfish or turfisk. The Lofoten archipelago in northern Norway is not merely picturesque. It was a production centre that turned cod into globally tradable protein. From roughly the 9th century onwards, communities in the Lofoten and Vestfjorden took advantage of seasonal cod migrations. Cod were plentiful in winter and spring. Catches swelled, and the need to preserve the catch for local winter use, and for trade, drove a particular technology, air drying on wooden racks called hjell. Fish were gutted, sometimes beheaded, and then tied in pairs by their tails and hung on frames exposed to cold, drying winds. The combination of low temperatures, steady winds, and lack of heavy precipitation created ideal desiccation conditions. Bacteria could not proliferate at these temperatures, so no salt was needed for long-term preservation. Within 3 to 4 months, fishes that might once have rotted became hard, lean boards of protein, stockfish, that could be stored for decades and shipped long distances. The result influenced geopolitics. Stockfish was a light and high-protein commodity, ideal for sailors and for markets in the Baltic and southern Europe. It was one of the commodities that allowed northern communities to participate in early medieval trade networks. In the sagas, and in later medieval trade accounts, the importance of dried cod surfaces repeatedly. Lofoten's winter fisheries were seasonal factories. Their produce became both food and currency. Drying was not the only method. Smoking and salting both play large roles in the Viking repertoire. For animal protein from livestock, autumn slaughter, around the Feast of Michaelmas in continental calendars, or at seasonal decline on the North Atlantic, was a planned event. It reduced the burden of forage during lean months and converted animals into long-term stores. Carcasses were split and either smoked under the longhouse roof, wind-dried in laundered breezes on the hills, or cured in salt. Salt itself was unevenly available. Coastal communities could produce salt by evaporating seawater over fires, but the yield was small and fuel-demanding. Salt was often an imported commodity. In medieval accounts, it carries the label white gold. Where money or access to salt allowed, meat was packed tight into barrels, layers of flesh interleaved with rock salt. The osmotic action draws out moisture, creating a brine that excludes microbes. Salted meat and fish could be stored for years. Smoking worked differently. It is lower tech and less fuel-intensive than producing salt in sufficient quantities. A thin, steady smoke from birch, oak, or peat both dehydrates and coats muscle fibres with compounds that reduce bacterial growth. Pieces of meat were left hanging in the attic or a smokehouse for weeks or months. The smokes further provided a barrier against insects and their eggs. In Iceland, the tradition of air-dried lamb hung on cliffs or in high wind, known today as svid or kestur, preserves a direct cultural continuance of that method. Fermentation is the more urban biochemical chapter in Norse food technology. Fermentation is controlled decomposition, harnessing microbes to convert otherwise volatile proteins and fats into stable, edible substances. The most famous Viking-era fermented product that survives into modern practice is harkal, fermented shark, from Greenlandic and Icelandic contexts. Fresh meat of certain shark species contains high concentrations of urea and trimethylamine oxide, compounds that make the flesh toxic or unpalatable if eaten fresh. The Norse developed a process that first buried the shark in gravel or sod for weeks to press out fluids, and then exposed the pieces to cold air to dry for several months. The end product is potent, ammonia-rich, and preserved. The process demonstrates a deep empirical grasp of both chemistry and ecology. A dangerous animal becomes edible through pressure, anaerobic transformation, and slow drying. The sagas and later Icelandic accounts describe such practices in the context of Greenland settlement from T985 AD onward. Fermented fish, rakfisk, lutefisk in later Scandinavian varieties also appears as a technique for places where salt was scarce or weather unsuitable for rapid drying. Fish lightly salted and packed into barrels will produce lactic acid fermentation over months, softening tissues and producing strong flavours. Such methods were often used inland or in mountainous areas where sea salt access was limited. The fermenting barrels even showed up in accounts where gases made them bulge, hard evidence that lactic fermentation produced carbon dioxide and altered textures. Heavier garden products, root vegetables, have their own story. Root crops like turnips, rutabagas, swedes, and wild carrots were harvested late into autumn and stored in sand or moss-filled pits. The principle is straightforward. A cool, humid, but unfrozen environment reduces metabolic respiration in stored roots and preserves texture. Archaeological storage pits found in Scandinavia sometimes contain layers of compacted moss or sand indicating deliberate bedding for roots. Cabbage too could be stored and fermented. The scurrying toward cabbage fermentation is essentially the same process that yields sauerkraut. Packed tightly into barrels, with modest salt or simply pressured to exclude oxygen, cabbage underwent lactic fermentation and provided vitamins crucial during months lacking fresh greenery. Beyond cultivated goods, the forests and bogs were active larders. Hazelnuts, common in Atlantic Europe, and berry species such as lingonberry, cloudberry, bilberry, wild blueberry, and crowberry were foraged and dried. Dried berries provided sugar and vitamins. Nuts supplied lipid calories. Archaeological recovery of charred nut remains, or pit contexts with thousands of berry seeds demonstrates the scale of collection. Honey, scarce and prized, was a luxury reserved for special events and mead production. Mead, emjod in Old Norse, was another way to stabilize calories. Honey fermented with water into a potent, durable beverage, carried and stored in barrels. A crucial element to emphasize is the role of beverages in the nutrition strategy. Drinking water in many rural locations could carry pathogenic organisms. Boiling was not always practical for everyday consumption. Fermented grain drinks, ale or earl, formed a staple beverage. This was not necessarily the strong mead of saga dinners, but a low-alcohol, nourishing brew akin to liquid bread. The process of malting and boiling killed most pathogens, and the brew provided calories. In many contexts, children drank thin ale because it was safer and because calories mattered. Hops were not consistently used in Viking-era brewing. Bittering herbs like yarrow or bog myrtle often flavoured brews. The ubiquity of the alehouse, or the presence of ale, in legal accounts, underlines its social and practical centrality. Even with these technologies, there were seasons when reserves failed. The so-called hungry gap, the late winter and early spring weeks when the last stores run low before new growth, was a period of acute risk, when sodden summers, failed harvests, or poor catches limited stores. People turned to extreme measures. Bark bread, the use of inner bark, cambium from trees, typically pine or elm, dried and ground, appears in medieval sources and in archaeological layers associated with desperate times. The cambium contains modest carbohydrate content and can be used as filler in bread. It is bitter and rough on digestion, but in famine it is a calorie extender. Other emergency measures include grinding lichen or moss, boiling leather for collagen-rich broth, or eating tree buds. These desperate practices were not daily life, they were emergency triage. The memory of them informs social choices. Invest labour in more durable storage now, or risk hunger later. Storing surplus becomes an act of insurance and of social stability. A myth-busting moment is necessary and inescapable. The popular image of Vikings as primarily meat-consuming warriors is misleading. Archaeobotanical studies, stable isotope analyses of skeletal remains, a morning moxen tedeken may, and faunal assemblages consistently show that cereals and dairy, along with fish, dominated diets in caloric terms. Meat was important, especially for ceremonies and prestige, but it was not the staple. Nor were all Norsemen berserkers living on raw meat and mead. Human physiology and economy demand reliable, calorie-dense staples. For most households that meant barley, porridge and ale, supplemented with dried fish, dairy and preserved roots. The warlike imagery obscures the quiet engineering that determined survival, the skill of the housewife at the quern, the ingenuity of the stabber, the timing of the fisheries. The history becomes more complex when we expand to the oceanic margins of the Norse world. Iceland settled in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. Traditional dates for first settlement range c. 874–930 AD presents a case study in adaptation. Pollen studies and archaeological field systems show that settlers brought barley cultivation and animal husbandry with them, but the island's climate and volcanic soils limited arable yield. Farmers made the most of sheltered valleys and coastal flatlands. They relied heavily on maritime resources. Icelandic sagas and law codes, Gragas and later law books, reflect food economies woven of fish, dairy, and limited cereals. The church in Iceland, monastic houses and ecclesiastical networks also forms part of an economic web for salt and luxury imports. But the core subsistence always depended upon a seasonal balancing act. Greenland's Norse settlements, founded by Eric the Red around c. 985 AD at Brattahlid, pushed the envelope of northern farming. The Norse established small farms on fjord mouths and sheltered in the relatively mild microclimates created by the ocean. Initially, the medieval warm period, often dated 950–1250 AD, allowed marginal agriculture to flourish. Barns and animal bones show that sheep, cattle and pigs were kept. Barley was cultivated on tiny plots. By the 13th and 14th centuries, however, climate trends likely shifted toward cooler conditions, regional cooling, that precedes what modern climatologists call the Little Ice Age, roughly c. 1300–1850 AD. The Norse in Greenland, unlike in Iceland, experienced a severe combination of factors: colder temperatures, variable sea ice that hindered communications and trade with Norway, declining demand for walrus ivory in Europe, and perhaps demographic pressures and social change. Historians widely assume climate played a role in the abandonment of Greenland's Norse farms by the 15th century, but scholars caution that this is contested. Economic reorientation, trade collapse, and internal social dynamics probably mattered too. Food storage and preservation could buy decades of resilience, but they could not single-handedly counter a multi-causal collapse of markets and logistics. Trade networks amplified what storage accomplished. Hedeby, Hythabu, a trading centre on the southern Scandinavian frontier, active from the 8th to the 11th centuries, collected and redistributed goods: grain, salt, iron, and dried fish. Between the North Sea, the Baltic, and continental Europe, marketplaces turned local surpluses into strategic reserves. A farmer with extra stockfish could trade for salt. A merchant could move salted meat southward in exchange for tools. The ability to convert preserved food into transportable, durable trade goods underwrote the Norse capacity to undertake long voyages. A ship leaving Bergen or Dublin for Greenland or Vinland, North America, around c. 1000 AD, needed lightweight caloric food that would not spoil. Stockfish, salted pork, barley cakes, and hard-tack-like breads fit the bill. Consider Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland around c. 1000 AD, attested in sagas and now confirmed by the archaeological site at Longso Meadows in Newfoundland, dated by tree ring chronologies and associated artefacts. The small Norse settlement is a material witness to the logistical ability to cross the North Atlantic and attempt settlement. Ships carried dried and salted food sufficient for months at sea. But they also relied on predictable seasonal behaviours: fishing at cod-rich seasons, hunting seals, and trading with indigenous peoples for fresh meat. The ability to dehydrate, salt, or ferment allowed crews to depart with confidence. Confidence born not of heroism alone, but of pantry science. Preservation techniques were not static. They evolved regionally and seasonally. In the southern Baltic and continental coasts, salt curing had earlier priority due to easier access to evaporated salt and trade connections with salt-producing Mediterranean economies. On the North Atlantic fringe, where wind and cold simplify drying, stockfish became the dominant export. In interior uplands, fermentation and smoking dominate where humidity complicates air drying and where salt is scarce. Local environments shape the hierarchy of choices. We should also consider resource investment. Preserving food requires labour, fuel, and space. Smoke curing demands peat or wood sustained over months. Salt curing requires boilers and evaporation surfaces. Stockfish demands racks and time. All of these are forms of capital. Historians often reconstruct this as economic planning. Years of surplus feed fund, weeks of preservation, communities that coordinated work, fishermen, coopers, housewives, produced export surpluses and local security. Surplus production, in turn, freed men to specialise: shipbuilding, smithing, voyage-taking. The sagas do not always tell this arithmetic, but the archaeology and documentary law material do. Fines paid in grain, land measured in arable strips, and barn sizes recorded in charters all testified to the centrality of stored calories to social power. A recurring debated point is how scientific these practices were. They were not laboratory science in our sense. They were iterative, empirical practices refined across generations. Fermentation rules: a little salt here, press the cabbage there, bury the shark in gravel for weeks, were accumulated and transmitted as household knowledge. When a method failed, the family paid a high price. When it succeeded, the technique spread. Archaeologists find continuity in the material record: repeated shapes of shell racks, standard dimensions in stabber, conserved textile patterns in sacks for grain. That continuity signals cultural transmission and practical success. Let us return to grain storage in detail. Grain must be dried to a certain moisture content to resist mould. In damp climates, stacking grain in elevated drying houses or seasoned barns on stilts mitigates fungal growth. Sacks and bins were often kept off the floor on wooden pallets. Rodent control included architectural measures, raised floors, narrow doorways that made carrying awkward, and social measures, guarding and legal penalties. There are law codes and saga passages that treat theft of grain with severity, because an empty barn meant vulnerability. Grain storage also implied social obligations, redistributing in bad years to prevent social rupture. That social aspect, recorded in charters and ecclesiastical records, shows how provisioning was not merely technical, but political. One of the more creative uses of local ecologies appears in peat bog storage. Peat bogs are acidic, anaerobic, and cold. They preserve organic matter spectacularly. Bodies, wooden objects, textiles. Norse people used bogs deliberately to store fats and other perishables. The chemistry of bogs leaches out certain compounds while inhibiting decay. Butter, wrapped carefully and buried in peat, emerges centuries later in archaeobotanical contexts, workable, though altered in flavour. Modern experiments demonstrate the feasibility of this method. The choice to use peat is an example of environmental engineering, selecting a landscape feature and repurposing it for preservation. One should not over-romanticize the past. Storage failed sometimes. Pests invaded, colder than usual winters killed animals or froze wells. The saga record is candid about hunger's social consequences, migrations, raiding, and pressure to secure better farmland. Such pressures partly explain outward expansion in the 9th and 10th centuries. In a world where surplus can be translated into ships, the presence of surplus matters directly for mobility. Yet outward movement was never solely an escape from winter. It was also an investment in more productive lands and trade opportunities. The long-term picture intersects with climate history. The medieval chronology of warming and cooling is complicated. From about 950 to 1250 AD, many northern areas experienced relatively mild conditions. The medieval warm period, which likely aided the settlement of Greenland and the flourishing of barley agriculture in marginal zones. From about 1300 AD onwards, conditions shifted toward the Little Ice Age, with increased sea ice and colder winters. Scholars widely assume climate shifts contributed to the decline of some Norse settlements, especially in Greenland. But causation is contested. The record suggests a combination of declining trade, demographic stress, overgrazing of fragile soils, and changing European demand for ivory. Food storage methods could mitigate weather variability, but not the breakdown of long-distance exchanges or the loss of markets. Archaeological finds help ground these narratives. Bone assemblages from sites in western Norway, Orkney, and Iceland show proportions of cattle, sheep, pig, and fish that align with written records. Cattle and sheep dominate faunal remains in pastoral contexts. Cod bones and processed fish elements dominate coastal production sites. Sediment cores show pollen spikes when grain cultivation increased. Charcoal and peat records reveal patterns of fuel use associated with smokehouses and salt boiling activities. Scientific analysis of residues in pottery sometimes reveals lipid signatures consistent with dairy processing, confirming the reliance on skyr and butter. Radiocarbon dating tightens chronology. Taken together, the material data and the Scandinavian written evidence, laws, saga snippets, monastic records, create a coherent picture. If you ask what made the difference between survival and starvation in a northern winter, the answer is layered. A well-built longhouse with storage pits and a smoke attic, a stabber protecting grain from damp and rodents, a winter fishery converted to rock-hard stockfish on hjell racks, skillful use of smoke and salt where available, the fermentation processes that turned otherwise dangerous or perishable materials into safe food, and social networks that ensured trade for salt and occasional imports. All of this was the quiet infrastructure of survival. A reflective pause is appropriate here. When the cameras and sagas focus on raids and voyages, they miss the slow human engineering that made longhouses into institutions of resilience. The Viking who sailed to Ireland in 1016 AD did not leave because he was a better fighter than his neighbour. He left because his household could spare men, because hulls and sails required time and grain, because the surplus of last winter was sufficient to feed those who built ships. The true genius was not a single cunning raid, but the aggregate of everyday practices. The ability to dry a cod, to bury a barrel in peat, to ferment cabbage for spring vitamins. We return finally to the central mystery posed at the start. How did communities living on the edge of climate and soil manage to maintain life through months of cold and darkness? The short answer is that they made winter a managed process. Winter was not a chaotic event to be endured, but a season to be prepared for through accumulated knowledge, built architecture, shared labour, and the transformation of local ecologies into preservation systems. Their pantries and smokehouses were not minor domestic features. They were the defensive works of a society that had learned to store life as a weapon against time. If this account raised questions about the precise role of climate in Greenland's collapse, about regional variations in storage vocabulary, or about the everyday rhythms of who ground grain and who tended the smoke, those are good questions. They point to the richest area of historical inquiry, the intersection of environment, technology, and social choice. Join the conversation below. What part of this infrastructure surprised you the most? Would you rather spend the winter in an Icelandic longhouse with a smoke attic,